provides legal advice to more than 20,000 European citizens annually, which exercise their right of free movement. The free movement is very dear right, part of European citizenship to our hearts, and not only for us. Most of European citizens believe that this is the most notable achievement of European integration, and it stands at the heart of the European project. Recent developments have shown that Europe is experiencing multiple crises, from tension at the external borders to restoring of internal borders, to crime and terrorist attacks and threats, and new forms of crime. It's very understandable that in this situation, European citizens are asking for more safety in their daily lives tomorrow. It's also very understandable that the decision makers, including the European ones, are trying to address those concerns. What we have been witnessing recently is that there are an increasing number of initiatives that have been discussed and even adopted based on the promise for more security for citizens tomorrow. We also have to make sure that their objectives cannot be achieved with what we already have in place as an instrument, enforcing and bringing security. Last but not least, it's very important to look and to make sure that the overall impact of all the measures and the instruments which are different in scope and content and aimed at security will not be out of proportion with regard to European citizens' rights. I believe that our distinguished speakers today will touch upon those subjects.
I was a student in the UK when the Irish troubles were ongoing. We didn't call it Christian terrorism then. We want to call it Muslim terrorism now. I don't quite know why. But there's an ongoing. The threat is ongoing. There are always soft targets. There's always a threat. The big problem that I see is that if you look at the failures of security agencies with leaders of the terror attacks going to the UK, one of them, despite having an international arrest warrant against him, going to the sites, having photographs taken, we seem to not have the political willingness or interest in looking at the security failures, but rather giving the security agencies whatever the flavour of the month is.
We should not be finalising the proposals just on the basis of one incident or another. In other words, the question of what we need in the way of security in something like PNR is, of course, a reaction to the threat. And you have to react to threats. When I was minister in London, of course, I was dealing with terrorism of a different kind, so I agree with Joe to some extent, but there's always something there. We had that Irish-based terrorism which was going on when I was a minister, and this was very, very frightening and very worrying. There were great differences in it, but therefore was reacted to by the intelligence services and the police in a way which they thought was most appropriate to be able to deal with it. Here we have a situation in a technologically developed world. You mentioned Facebook before everyone puts their hand up. I mean, the amount of information, of course, that you give to your supermarket to get your club card, or you give to Apple, or you give to Google, quite willingly, you don't care much, because it's what you actually want through technology and so on. The one good thing about a governmental situation like a PNR is it is a very ring-fenced, specific area which we're dealing with here, which has to have appropriate safeguards on it, and I believe we have. We're dealing with people who are using the very technology, the very intrusion into our privacy, the very knowledge-based sort of terrorist or criminal behavior that we now have to tackle with our own intelligence and police. And I think that's why we have to change things and why we have to introduce things, but not losing the need to protect the privacy as far as we can, safeguard and give redress to the citizens who are improperly dealt with. That's the key.
The threat has also evolved because these people, as opposed to what happened in the 90s and the 70s and 80s as well in countries like mine, Italy, the UK and others, these people are now much more mobile and they travel across Europe. And they can do so also because we have a borderless space, or we have Schengen space, that does not require any controls in between the borders. I do think the answer when it comes to security is not to appeal to some sort of a European sense of demos or whatever. It's to appeal to something very simple, which is some sort of an internal market in security. So in the same way that we have a borderless space and people can travel freely, we need to have some sort of counteracting measures in order to ensure that this space keeps on being open and we keep on having some sort of open internal market on people, if you want to call it this way. And that's where the European Union comes. On the second question of Schengen is that if I got a euro for every time that, once again, the UK media ask me and probably other people in the panel whether Schengen is dead, I would be rich. By now, I don't think Schengen is dead, but I think it's still, actually. And I think if we don't do something to ensure, indeed, that we have a common policy, not only on migration, but also on security, we will be all certifying Schengen sets in a couple of years.
Schengen, of course, is the sort of the demolition of physical borders, therefore the greater cooperation in terms of freedom of movement and other things across Europe. But, you know, it's not the only thing. We just heard a moment ago about the police cooperation. We've got loads of things in place, ladies and gentlemen, to encourage cooperation and working together. Apart from things like an EU PNR, we have had another thing I must admit I was responsible for, but it's been in place for some years, which is the setting up joint investigation teams between police forces all over Europe. How many times have they actually done this? Well, the answer is rather a limited number, to be frank, but the powers are there. The powers in Europol sometimes is a frustration by the Europol senior officers, I think, that they don't get the kind of cooperation that they need to have between the member states in catching criminals. So as I said, the physical borders, whether they're up or whether they're down, is not just the whole answer here. My own feeling is that as much freedom of movement is a good thing.
That we were with the euro and the survival of the eurozone in 2011 and 12. And the same question was answered there, whether we have to come back to national currencies or we have to develop any law and new solutions to the crisis. And the second road was more or less followed, and the crisis somehow was shelved for the time being. We are in the same crossroad in Schengen. We were lucky in January somehow that those terrorists in Paris didn't cross the border. They stayed in France, so Schengen is no question, not putting so much strain there. But we were less lucky in November, so of course Schengen is on the front line and is certainly threatened. And I have absolutely no clue what can come out of it. So the Commission is actually, as you said, Nicholas, is actually trying to modify the Schengen Code in the way that the controls of EU citizens should be systematic on external borders. We can question the necessity of proportionality, of course, but yeah. Will we save Schengen? We will see.
We're told with complete certainty from the European Commission that we needed the Data Retention Directive in order to enable cooperation and data sharing across borders. When the Commission, 9 months after the legal deadline to do so, finally published its implementation report, it noted that fewer than 1%, it didn't indicate how much fewer than 1%, but fewer than 1% of data access requests were actually cross-border. So the argument that had been used by the European Commission was simply wrong. So we have a lack of mandatory data sharing in EU PNR. We have a now defunct data retention directive based on a claim that it was needed cross-border when it wasn't. If I can comment very briefly on the supermarket club card. My supermarket club card tells the supermarket whether I like cheese or not. PNR tells them whether I might be a terrorist or not. There's a little bit of a difference.
The information that they take about you and your things you like to buy, things you like to get involved in, your food and all the rest of it, to be honest, is more of an invasion of the privacy of the individual than some of the questions which actually are subject to the security and safeguards that the government might want or the agencies might want in order to prevent terrorism or prevent some criminal activity. I mean, people are so willing to give that information. You can be profiled easily. And here's a chap who just drinks Guinness. I mean, what on earth? Anything like that, that information is appalling in the amount of information we give willingly. And that is this is what we have. We have a massive contrast here. On the one hand, we're all throwing away information all the time, every day, so we can get a free download of some music or other. All we're doing is all that. On the other hand, we're all closing down on the authorities and saying, I'm sorry, no data must be taken from anybody because that is against freedom. And I think that there's an interesting little contradiction in this, which I'm not sure we've really got right in our minds. I'm not sure we have. And I would be the first to make it clear that individual systems, particularly with the way travel now is undertaken, can never be as effective as one system with standards, or these systems, number of systems, but all with the same standards, the same protections, the same inquiry, and the same data retention period. Now that is going to make the systems in France and Britain more effective in future, but it's also going to make sure we do not get a random PNR operation going on in a whole lot of other European countries which do not talk to each other, where there may be different standards, or less standards in some cases, which are not properly monitored and so on. So another reason for getting PNR is that we are doing something which is going to be effective across 28 states. And the interchange of information reflects the travelling patterns of people nowadays. And it is a much more sensible approach. That was why I pushed so hard for this. Because otherwise we would have a whole lot of them, all, I think, creating a chaotic situation in which the only beneficiaries inevitably must be either those with a motive of doing us harm in one way or another, whether it's criminals or terrorists.
While the state retention regimes of member states which do not have data retention, the criminals will easily avoid the data retention measures in other member states by taking their forms in country where there's no data retention, or using providers where there's no data retention. And then it makes inefficient or less efficient the measures adopted by other member states. So that justifies the EU measure, not the number of cases which are transnational cases, transnational terrorists.
The United States asked for data retention in 1999. The UK, in the e-privacy directive, pushed quite hard for the data retention measure. They ultimately got Article 15.1, which was weaker than what they wanted, but it was there was an informal vote in the Council before September 11, and it was 14 countries against one, the UK being the one. Subsequent to the September 11 attacks, in the state of drunkenness, 15 member states supported the measure. The legal base was chosen because it was impossible to get data retention through on a police cooperation basis. It was a dishonest legal farce, harmonizing something that didn't need harmonization. And in keeping with that tradition, the European Commission reacted to the first Parliament committee vote by funding the national PNR measures, which were being adopted in different ways, thereby funding a disharmonization of the market, which is then needed to fix with the PNR directive. which is frankly scandalous behaviour.
Everybody's sharing information all the time. So if you've got a smart and, once again, judicially supervised use of this data that we will share anyway, you can actually start tailoring it, some security measures, and also you can help to weed out people for what you need a little bit of profiling to probably doesn't like those. I do think there is potential on the use of data if we do it right and if we do it within established legal basis to have some sort of smart security.
It was mentioned that we suffered in London from the IRA terror threat that went on for quite a long time. We had all the things like the ring of steel around the city and all those sorts of security measures that were put in place then. Is there anything in the current discussion on security that would think that things will get better, that you can gradually get rid of some of these security measures that are being put in place now, as we in London have gradually got rid of the ring of steel and various other security measures because the threat has gone down?
Looking back on it now, although it cut crime almost straight away, we weren't terribly aware or interested, to be honest, in the 90s about the question of privacy, which we are now much more attuned to, particularly in the European Parliament. I think that has changed, so therefore that balance has changed. We're now aware of everything we're doing and supporting has to have the element in it. And to answer the lady's point about to what extent PNR, of course, is automatically backloaded with the provisions of data protection package if they enhance the safeguards. Please remember, the data protection package going through Parliament at the moment is on all data. It's on data for all kinds of purposes. Whereas PNR, as I said a few moments ago, is a ring-fenced operation subject to particular safeguards that relate to the nature of the information being obtained. But it will get the enhancement if that enhancement is necessary from the data protection package. The final thing is, you mentioned API. Yes, it does enhance the API questions that all of us are now answering all the time every time we travel by air. Again, without any real protections on that information that we're giving to the airlines, except that in some cases it's being commercially exploited. There will be some more questions, but people ask me things like, are these questions very intrusive? No, they're not, because although Joe decries this, I think he was very, very sarcastic about the reference to patterns of behaviour. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, what is being looked at, there is very little manual input into this. An awful lot of this is now dealt with, or will be dealt with by computers, because it is only in certain cases, very narrow cases, that there will be any interest at all in people who are travelling. Only in very narrow cases. And the information that's being provided that is different to API simply creates or gives the information through details of travel booking and so on, which actually provides those very patterns that help our intelligence agencies and police to look at people of interest as a result. It is very narrow, but I think that it's certainly not intended to profile people in the sense that maybe the Stasi and the DDR like to do and so on. And it's not like that at all, I'm sure.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to ECAS and our panelists for providing us with the opportunity to debate very important issues. The European Union was set up 17 years ago, my goodness, they are old, to chart a course for Europe away from the devastation of the World War and towards a more united and European continent. And unfortunately, for the first time today, we are again at a crossroads and we're facing important questions, like the one we discussed tonight, but many more. So through our 75 members in 39 countries around Europe, together with our partners here in Brussels, not least ECAS, we want to address those questions head on, because we have an important job to do, and that is to keep our continent together.